Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week is kind of fun because we're talking about Thor, the Eternal Saga. It's Thor, the Eternal Saga. This is a Marvel Epic Collection which was just released. It is Thor Volume 10, which has stories from 1979 to 1980. And we've been waiting for Volume 10 forever. We've got Volume 11, we've got Volume 12, didn't have Volume 10, which is the way it goes with Marvel Epic Collections. They're not published chronologically, so there are always these gaps. And we've been waiting for this one for a long time. This is a really interesting period in Thor. I recently read all of the original run of Thor, which ran from the early 1960s until 1996, when we had that whole Heroes Reborn fiasco and Thor was canceled. Only to come back, I think it was a year later, when the whole Heroes Reborn thing was over, Thor got a comic book again with a new #1 issue. But I read everything up to that point, and this was a really interesting time on Thor from 1979 to 1980. Because at this time, Roy Thomas was writing the book. Roy Thomas, who's written everything, and is probably best known for his time on Conan the Barbarian. He brought Conan to Marvel Comics. It was his idea to do it. And he wrote over 100 issues of Conan. But he wrote a ton of other things. He wrote everything, like I said. And his time on Thor was interesting. Also, we have the artwork in here, which is by Keith Pollard, who is an artist I like a lot. I think he's really, really good on Thor. Keith Pollard. He was an artist who did, he's probably best known for his artwork on Thor, but he also did Spider-Man as well. He also did artwork for The Amazing Spider-Man. And he's really good. And I'm glad that he was on the book at this time because Roy Thomas decided to really lean heavily into the fantasy elements of Thor. So Thor is a comic book that always kind of balanced this high fantasy stuff having to do with Thor and Asgard and all the Asgardians. And on the other hand, we also had Thor having adventures on Earth and having a secret identity as the lame Dr. Donald Blake, who is lame in more ways than one. And so always on Thor, you have this kind of balance between these two different elements in the book. But Roy Thomas decided, he's going to lean heavily on the fantasy. And he sort of left Dr. Donald Blake behind and all of the adventures on Earth, which is good because the really interesting stuff in Thor has always been the fantasy stuff. And I was not sorry to see Dr. Donald Blake forgotten about for a while. And in this series of books, Roy Thomas is trying to do something interesting in that he's leaning heavily on the mythology of Thor and the Norse gods. But in Marvel Comics, we had a bunch of different mythologies that were all kind of floating around. We have the gods on Olympus, we have Norse mythology, and we also have Jack Kirby's Eternals. And the Eternals was a comic book created by Jack Kirby, which, when it was started, kind of existed outside of the Marvel Universe. At least it seemed like it did. Eventually, it became part of the Marvel Universe like everything else. But the Eternals are these ancient beings who were supposed to be the basis for the Olympic gods. So you had a character that was supposed to be the inspiration for Zeus, for example, and the other Olympic gods. But in Marvel, they existed alongside the Olympic gods themselves, who were characters in the Marvel Universe, thanks to Thor. And Roy Thomas was trying to take all of these conflicting mythologies and have them all make sense, which is probably a lost cause, and it was not entirely successful. And he was trying to also bring in all kinds of other stuff in his time on Thor. You have an annual in here where you have the Trojan War, for example, which Thor was a part of. He was? Yes, apparently he was part of the Trojan War, mostly just because Roy Thomas wanted to do a Trojan War comic, and he put Thor in there. And John Buscema drew that one, so that was awesome. But most of this is a series of stories that has Thor and Odin and the Asgardians having to deal with the Celestials, which are these gigantic, immortal, unconquerable beings who are coming to Earth to judge the Earth. And if they decide that the Earth is unworthy, they're going to destroy it. And this is a threat to the entire universe. And so Thor, obviously, as a protector of the Earth, has to stand against these Celestials just in case they decide to destroy the Earth. And so basically that's the heart of these stories. But it has all kinds of weird stuff that happens. We do start off with some Earth adventures before we get to the crazy fantasy stuff with the Eternals. And like I said, I'm glad that Pollard drew this. Pollard, an excellent artist who left comic books in the 90s because he became a computer programmer, and he could make more money at the time being a computer programmer than he could being a comic book artist. And he also probably didn't have to work as much because he was really worked hard at Marvel. But he always did quality work, and he was able to put across the epicness that you needed on this comic book. And you just have some great stuff in this epic collection. As far as Thor epic collections go, I really, really recommend this one. Because Thor is fighting this kind of hopeless battle against these Celestials. And at one point, we have some really interesting stuff going on. Pollard's really good at drawing Odin. And one of the weird things that happens in this comic book, let's see if I can get to the beginning of it. I'll find it. Okay, here we go. This is where Thor meets this gigantic eyeball, and this is Odin's eye. You know, Odin lost an eye because he needed some knowledge, and so the cost of that was his eye, which he got back somehow. But at the time, Odin's eye was floating around and became its own being, and Odin's eye tells, it's really strange, and Odin's eye tells Thor the origin of Odin and all of the Norse gods. And he gives this entire mythological backstory for Odin, and he gives missing portions of Thor's existence that Thor didn't know about, and it's all crap. As we learned later, all of this was retconned. I mean, the entire backstory that Roy Thomas comes up with here, which is pretty wild. Yeah, it all gets retconned later on. You can never trust a floating eyeball because, they're just liable to just tell you nonsense. But we have many pages of backstory where the floating eyeball is telling all this stuff to Thor. And that goes on for a while. And we also have a whole story where it turns out that Thor had a previous identity that he didn't know anything about, where he was Sigurd. And the whole Wagner's Ring opera, the whole mythology behind that, Thor was a part of that, apparently. Mostly just because Roy Thomas wanted to put that all in a comic book. And again, I was grateful that we had Keith Pollard to draw it. And so that was really weird, but kind of cool. But the greatest part of this comic book is when the Celestials there finally show up. And we have this kind of grand conclusion. Because what happens is Odin breaks out the Destroyer. Now, we who have been reading Thor long enough, we know that the Destroyer is this suit of armor that is inhabited by a soul, whoever's soul inhabits it. And it was created by Odin to fight a great threat. Eventually a great threat would arrive, and we need to have the Destroyer there to fight off whatever the threat was. In the meantime, the Destroyer just causes trouble. I mean, it's a terrible invention which just wreaks havoc and destruction over the years, as it is inhabited by one villain after another, or used by one villain after another. But here it turns out that the actual reason that the Destroyer was created was to fight off these guys. It is revealed that is why the Destroyer was actually created. And that's also why the Oversword of Asgard was created as well, this giant sword that has also been kind of a threat, because if it's ever drawn from its sheath, we will get Ragnarok. So why on earth would this even exist? Well, it turns out it exists, according to Roy Thomas, to fight off the Celestials. It's there to fight off the Celestials. And Odin inhabits the dread Destroyer when the moment arrives that the Celestials show up. And it's just awesome. And here we have the assembled celestial host. All the Celestials are there. And this gives you an example of one of the things that are not so great about Epic Collections: gutter loss. In the center there, you can't see him that well, but that's the Destroyer, lost in the gutter of this trade paperback. Oh well. If there's an omnibus of this volume, I'm sure it looks a little better than that. But anyway, the Destroyer battles the Celestials. And I thought this was awesome, because I'm like, this is what the Destroyer was here for? Awesome, we finally have a reason for this thing's existence. And I thought that the Destroyer was just going to take out these Celestials. But wouldn't you know it, the Destroyer is just destroyed, which was kind of a disappointment. The Celestials just kicked the Destroyer's ass. What? This existed for all of this time just in order to get destroyed? So the Destroyer is destroyed. And you're thinking, wait, I've seen the Destroyer 100 times since then. Nothing stays destroyed in comic book land. You destroy a villain, the villain will come back. Or if it's a major character, the major character will come back. Nobody stays dead in comic books. But Thor doesn't know this at the time, and so he freaks out, and he's going to take out the Celestials. Now, of course, he can't. I mean, if the Destroyer can't do it, he can't do it. But he does a pretty good job at the beginning, before having his ass handed to him, and he has to be saved by his mom. Sometimes you get in trouble and only your mom can help you out. And Thor's mom shows up and saves him. His mom saves him. And at this point, I think it's right around here. Let me take a look. Roy Thomas actually left. He set all of this story up, but the story is taken over by Mark Grunwald and Ralph Macchio. And we still have Keith Pollard, thank goodness. But Roy Thomas actually left Marvel, I think, at the time. I can't remember the exact circumstances, but he left. And Jim Shooter was the editor, I think, at the time. And Roy Thomas originally was the editor of Thor, as well as being the writer. But for whatever reason, Marvel decided that they didn't want writers and editors, or writer-editors, to exist. They wanted one guy to be the writer and one person to be the editor. And I don't think Roy Thomas liked that so much, and so he just left. And Jim Shooter was the editor of Thor after that. And Jim Shooter, I believe it was his idea to tone down all the mythological stuff, to bring Thor back to Earth, and to bring back Dr. Donald Blake, who, like I said, I never liked Dr. Donald Blake. I was happy to see him gone for all of these issues. But no, they had to bring him back. And so after these issues that lean so heavily on mythology and the fantasy element of the Thor comic book, after that, we get a lot of Thor on Earth. And it started to go downhill. There was a noticeable loss of quality after the issues in this epic collection. Keith Pollard left, and we had different artists on the book. And eventually, the Thor comic book really went downhill, and we had a particularly bad period right before Walt Simonson came on the book. And then Thor was amazing. Thor was incredible at that point. But this was a really interesting time on Thor. This is a tremendously fun epic collection, and I'm really happy it's finally around. So I can't recommend this highly enough. It's so much fun. It's Thor. It's the Eternal Saga. There you go. Okay, I guess we will take off now. I will catch you next time.